The opening and the setting. America, in 2006. Stepping back to the United States in 2006 feels like opening a time capsule brimming with tremors and undercurrents. The country is entrenched in a period of immense transition, with news cycles dominated by international affairs, the lingering shadows of war, surges in political polarization, and the ever-growing influence of mass media. Technology is reshaping communication. Social platforms like Facebook and YouTube are beginning to redefine how Americans interact and consume information. I recall the relentless 24-hour news ticker painting every living room in red, white, and blue, fueling debates on everything from foreign policy to domestic security. Politically, the Bush administration is in its second term, riding out the tremors left by the post-9/11 world. The public remains sharply divided about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Echoes of fear, patriotism, suspicion, and hope layer every conversation. Dissent and protest blend with a renewed sense of national identity. American society is simultaneously restless and weary, with trust in institutions showing cracks more visible than ever before. Economically, the mid-2000s promise brilliance with a housing market that seems unstoppable. Wall Street's optimism is infectious, but beneath the surface there's an anxious energy, an almost unspoken suspicion that something isn't entirely right. Everyday life hums with business as usual. Rising stars in Hollywood, a booming real estate market, Wall Street buzz, pop culture icons, and the typical hustle of American cities. But underneath, drawing lines through all walks of life, is the uncertainty of what the future holds. On the streets of New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and countless American towns, the culture is a paradox of security and anxiety, opportunity and inequity. Immigration is a major talking point, stirring discussions in both Congress and local communities, as new waves of arrivals seek the American dream. The cultural landscape, too, feels electric. Artists and activists, tech moguls and politicians, all competing for attention, all seeking to shape America's story. This is the backdrop over which a case of shocking brutality will soon unfold. The echoes of power struggles and political intrigue mix with America's characteristic optimism and restlessness. It's amid this noisy, ambitious, uncertain America that a single crime will send waves through the highest corridors of government and the most ordinary kitchens. The public, already attuned to scandals, both real and manufactured, will find itself tangled in a story more complex, bizarre, and chilling than any other dominating the headlines. At the heart of it all, the question of power: who wields it, who manipulates it, and what happens when someone is caught in its crosshairs. The mysterious disappearance in New York. On a brisk October evening, as the city lights spilled over the glistening streets of Manhattan and New Yorkers hustled home in their winter coats, my phone rang with a call that would shatter the routine stillness of the night. The message was simple, yet chilling. Anastasia Gregory, a young Russian-American woman with a notable presence in New York's social scene, had vanished without a trace. What made this case instantly different was the urgency and fear in her cousin's voice. A sense that this wasn't just another argument or city misadventure, but something much darker. Anastasia was expected at a private dinner earlier that evening, attended by friends and a few influential business contacts. She had been seen entering the sleek lobby of a well-known hotel in Midtown, her trademark red scarf draped over her shoulders, her phone buzzing with last-minute messages. Security cameras captured nothing unusual, just a beautiful woman moving with the confidence she was known for. But, inexplicably, she never emerged again, and her phone went silent soon after. By midnight she hadn't returned home. The cousin, her lone family member living in New York, grew frantic. Panic set in as calls to Anastasia's cell phone went straight to voicemail, and messages were left unread. Without hesitating, the cousin went directly to the local police precinct only to find a weary skepticism on the other side of the desk. Missing adults weren't exactly rare in a city of millions. The initial presumption was that this might be a lover's quarrel, a socialite's spontaneous adventure, or even an attempt at dodging the press. Hours stretched into the early morning, every minute amplifying the cousin's dread and sense of helplessness. But as I would come to learn, there were already currents swirling beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, quiet phone calls were exchanged. First with the Russian consulate, prompted by her cousin's insistence, then to figures well outside the normal reach of New York law enforcement. Not long after the police took the initial report, reporters began circling the story. Whispers spread that Anastasia's disappearance might be more than a typical case. She wasn't simply a socialite, she was also known to have connections with powerful players in entertainment, finance, and even international diplomacy. With her sudden absence, the city's rumor mill ignited. Within 24 hours, the case escalated. The Russian embassy dispatched staff to work directly with authorities, and the NYPD assigned special detectives to reassess what had initially been dismissed as a possible misunderstanding. Hotel staff were pulled into closed-room interviews, surveillance footage was reviewed again, and witnesses were questioned about anything unusual, anyone too interested in Anastasia, any odd faces in the lobby, and the last person to see her alive. That's when the contradictions began to emerge. Phone records didn't match up with key witness statements, staff suddenly claimed faulty memories, and pieces of surveillance footage seemed to glitch, mysteriously missing frames for crucial time windows. The hotel, usually eager to project an image of safety and luxury, grew increasingly defensive, subtle signs that the stakes were suddenly much higher than the disappearance of just one woman, no matter how well known. As these first 24 hours passed, I found myself pulled deeper into the case. Anastasia's name was already making quiet headlines, with editors and producers scenting the kind of scandal that could explode across national airwaves. But for her cousin, and those of us now drawn into the mystery, the questions weren't about ratings. They were urgent, desperate, and chillingly simple. What had happened to Anastasia Gregory between the moment she walked into that hotel and the instant the city seemed to swallow her whole? Who stood to gain from her disappearance? And just how far would certain people go to cover their tracks? Initial suspicions and investigation. The hours following Anastasia Gregory's disappearance quickly turned charged with uncertainty and unspoken dread. Despite her social prominence, the New York Police Department's initial approach was surprisingly procedural, almost perfunctory. The detective at the precinct, a middle-aged officer with tired eyes and a worn badge, listened to every word from Anastasia's cousin but couldn't quite shake the city's routine cynicism. After all, adults went missing in Manhattan every day, often reappearing with little more than embarrassing stories or tales of personal escape. But the cousin's unease was undeniable. Anastasia's lack of response, her uncharacteristic silence on social media, and, most critical, a series of unanswered calls she'd made just before vanishing. These details quickly escalated the concern, even as early speculation in the station ranged from a possible lover's spat to a dramatic attempt at evading public scrutiny. Yet, the cousin's persistence paid off. After being turned away by one desk sergeant, she managed to press her case with a supervisor, who reluctantly agreed to file an official missing persons report. Almost immediately, the story began to shift. That same evening, a representative from the Russian consulate, prompted by the cousin's urgent call, arrived at the station in person. Their presence changed the temperature in the room. Now, a missing persons case involving international attention hovered over the investigation. Soon after, a detective from the NYPD's Special Victims Unit was quietly authorized to review the case file, not to take over directly but to look for any red flags. The first sweep, standard protocol, focused on Anastasia's recent activities. Her calendar was full of events, from closed-door business meetings to high-profile gallery openings. Security footage from the Midtown Hotel was re-examined frame by frame. Technicians searched for signs of tampering or oddities. Several faces in the lobby were flagged for further scrutiny. One sharply dressed man in a dark overcoat lingering near the elevators, a woman seemingly watching Anastasia from across the room. The doorman who'd seen Anastasia arrive seemed unsettled during his second police interview, hesitating over details. He recalled her greeting him with her signature confident nod, but was vague about who entered the elevator or if anyone followed her in. Parallel to the police's intensive efforts, whispers started to stir in elite circles and certain newsrooms. Rather than dismissing the case as routine, a handful of experienced journalists began their own digging. One, a seasoned crime reporter with a knack for uncovering political scandal, received an anonymous tip alluding to high-level connections and suggesting Anastasia's disappearance was more than personal misadventure. Meanwhile, investigators began noticing subtle resistance. Some hotel employees, initially cooperative, grew less forthcoming, as if warned to stay silent. One maid, who had reportedly noticed a heated argument in the hallway earlier that evening, later retracted her statement under what appeared to be management's pressure. Pieces of the puzzle, the pattern of calls, the guests who had checked in and out, even certain minutes of hotel security logs, began to look less like missing data, and more like a deliberate erasure. IT staff claimed system glitches just when those vital minutes were in play. Pressure on the NYPD mounted as both the Russian consulate and the victim's high-profile acquaintances demanded more aggressive investigation. Within days, City Hall fielded calls from Washington. Soon, federal agents offered assistance, further complicating jurisdiction and raising eyebrows. A sense of unease settled among junior officers. Had they stumbled into political crossfire? Was the case being used as leverage, or worse, purposefully stifled? The earliest phase of the investigation was thus defined by uncertainty and mounting paranoia, conflicted witnesses, lost time, and missing paperwork clouding the trail. Many in the unit began to suspect they were up against forces wielding influence far beyond a typical missing person case. As suspicion thickened and the pressure mounted, it became clear, discovering what happened to Anastasia would demand not only skill and persistence, but an unusual willingness to face down shadows both inside and outside the department. Information about Anastasia Gregory. Anastasia Gregory was far more than just a familiar face in the New York social circuit. She embodied the complexities and contradictions of a global citizen shaped by privilege, intelligence, and relentless ambition. Born in 1982 to a Russian-American father and a mother who worked as a U.S. immigration attorney, Anastasia spent her formative years on multiple continents. Her early education took place in Moscow and Paris, where she quickly became fluent in Russian, French, and later, English. This linguistic agility, paired with a striking appearance and innate charisma, opened doors in diplomatic and high society circles alike. Back in the States, Anastasia attended an Ivy League university, majoring in international relations and art history. Her professors described her as fiercely intelligent, a woman capable of holding her own in debates about art, politics, or cultural identity. Yet even among the brilliant, she stood out for never staying in one place too long, always seeking the next adventure or connection that would lift her above the crowd. By her early 20s, she was already a fixture at gallery openings, charity galas, and exclusive fundraising events, counted among a new generation of elite, cosmopolitan Americans who straddled worlds with apparent ease. But Anastasia's story wasn't just one of privilege. Beneath her cultivated exterior was a relentless drive to create her own legacy. Friends and family painted portraits of a woman who was both captivating and enigmatic, someone who used her charm to conceal hard-earned emotional fortitude. Perhaps the scars of growing up between cultures, or the pressure to succeed in a world where expectations were sky-high, had left their personal toll. Rumors often swirled, tales of whirlwind love affairs, brief marriages to affluent men, and a few mysterious business ventures that no one could quite pin down. She was known to invest in and co-found a handful of fashion and tech export startups, some of which appeared functional mainly as passports to even more rarefied circles. The significance of Anastasia's background became even more apparent after her disappearance. Journalists dug deep and discovered connections that spanned the worlds of finance, art, and international diplomacy. Some who knew her suggested that her network included not only high-ranking officials in the U.S. government, but also influential figures in Russia and Western Europe. Her name appeared in the guest lists of embassies, discreet boardroom meetings, and off-the-record parties at penthouse suites. It wasn't mere accident. Anastasia had worked hard to cultivate these links, and those connections would soon draw the glare of investigators and the public alike, as theories multiplied about what secrets she might have known or what role she really played in the power games of those around her. Business mysteries and relationships. With every new lead I pursued about Anastasia Gregory's business activities, the more opaque and labyrinthine her world became. On the surface, Anastasia seemed to be at the helm of a burgeoning fashion export company based in Manhattan, supposedly dedicated to connecting niche American designers with luxury boutiques in Europe and Asia. She was frequently photographed at trunk shows, launch parties, and invite-only networking events, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by an eclectic mix of artists, celebrities, diplomats, and high-flying financiers. Yet none of these public appearances offered any true clarity about her actual business operations. When I tried to map out the logistics of her supposed export ventures, distinct patterns and inconsistencies began to emerge. Shipments listed on her company's books often referenced designer brands that didn't seem to exist outside of her own marketing copy. Names and addresses on customs forms pointed to shell companies and vacant lots. Former employees I discreetly contacted described a glamorous but curiously non-committal office culture, where work hours were irregular, roles were vague, and conversations quickly shifted from business to whispered gossip about prominent clients and visitors. There were rumors of parties thrown not for business growth, but to facilitate introductions to certain shadowy, influential individuals. The lines between business, pleasure, and power brokering were astonishingly blurred. Anastasia made frequent trips to Los Angeles, London, Dubai, and the south of France, always under the auspices of conferences or fashion weeks, but rarely returning with tangible results or merchandise. Her expense accounts, when examined, revealed exorbitant spending on exclusive dinners, designer gifts, and luxury travel, all paid for through corporate funds. Yet, curiously, the business never actually posted a profit or major loss. It just kept moving, cash flowing in from mysterious consulting fees, and vanishing just as suddenly through wire transfers abroad. Even her close associates seemed reluctant to speak publicly. Some business partners would admit in hushed tones that they had never actually closed a deal or seen a signed contract for any merchandise. Others insisted Anastasia's real value lay in her ability to open doors with her charm, and that her Rolodex was more valuable than any physical inventory. A few even speculated that her company was less a legitimate business than a vehicle for networking, possibly for reasons far beyond commerce. All these anomalies generated persistent speculation among investigators. Was Anastasia's fashion business a cover for something deeper and more insidious? Money laundering, espionage, or facilitating discreet introductions among the global elite? The entities that she brushed shoulders with, wealth management firms, diplomatic attachés, retired generals, even entertainment moguls, made the waters even murkier. The deeper I dug, the more I wondered just how many hidden transactions and secret alliances were stitched into the fabric of her glossy, high-profile life. Chilling discovery on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. There are moments in life when time itself seems to rupture, when something so shocking, so far outside the boundaries of what we expect, happens and rewrites the script for everyone involved. For me, that moment came just over 5 weeks after Anastasia Gregory vanished from New York, when a discovery was made in a wooded area outside a quiet suburb near Washington, D.C. It was the sort of place where the skyline faded into old-growth trees, where the rush of traffic melted away into the low hum of crickets. If not for the events that would unfold, it could have been a postcard for suburban tranquility. But that particular morning, tranquility was shattered. A county ranger, making a routine patrol after a night of high winds and falling branches, stumbled upon what he first thought was some kind of wildlife disturbance. Torn earth, a few scattered personal items, a flash of crimson against the otherwise muted fall palette. Approaching cautiously, he realized it was something much graver. Later I spoke to this man, his hands still shaking as he recounted the shape he saw, wrapped in a designer coat half buried in the brown leaves and mud. It was unmistakably a body, and the coroner would soon confirm the worst. The victim was Anastasia Gregory. The news hit the airwaves within hours, rocketing from police scanners to breaking news alerts in New York, D.C., and beyond. For days, media vans jammed the narrow roads near the crime scene, satellite dishes blooming like alien flowers against the subdued Maryland woods. Reporters speculated wildly, had Anastasia been transported across state lines? Had she been alive for days before her death, held somewhere in secret captivity? Was someone trying to send a message? If so, to whom? The official police briefing, staged behind yellow tape and flashing lights, tried to restrain the surging rumors. The body presented clear evidence of violence, 2 gunshot wounds, the kind that brooked no mistake, and perhaps even more chillingly, residue of a military-grade explosive at the scene. This detail, which investigators kept closely guarded at first, leaked quickly through the grapevine of federal agents, local law enforcement, and the ever-hungry news cycles. Only people with access to restricted materials, certain defense contractors, law enforcement, or military operatives, could have procured such an item. Suddenly, what had looked like a tragic but possibly personal crime escalated to a high-stakes game involving the deepest pockets and most guarded secrets of the capital. That realization sent shockwaves throughout the local police and federal agencies. At the state medical examiner's office, every inch of Anastasia's remains was scrutinized. Signs pointed to trauma beyond the gunshots, a jagged bruise along her collarbone, fractured nails from what looked like a desperate struggle, and marks suggesting she was restrained for an unknown period. Her jewelry oddly remained intact, a sapphire pendant, a gold bracelet with a tiny engraving, each detail now a potential clue in the labyrinthine case. The forensics team worked around the clock for days, logging soil samples, swabs taken from under her fingernails, and tiny paint chips found embedded in the lining of her coat. These would later be matched to the door of a nondescript government-issued vehicle, adding yet another question: who had access to such resources and why would they dispose of her body here, so close to places of power but just far enough to evade immediate discovery? At the heart of the investigation was the strange mixture of deliberate concealment and bold display. Whoever killed Anastasia had taken great pains to cover their tracks. There were no possible security cameras within half a mile, and the approach to the woods left no obvious vehicle tracks thanks to the previous night's rain. Yet the choice to leave her in an area within the shadow of the nation's political heartland seemed like taunting law enforcement, almost an act of theatrical provocation. Detectives from the FBI, Secret Service, and local homicide units descended on the site, each agency staking its jurisdiction with layers of bureaucracy and veiled suspicion. I remember watching them move, clipboards, evidence bags, suits cutting paths through the brush, all wary of each other, all aware this case threatened reputations and careers at levels not often encountered by your average suburban crime. Their conversations, when overheard, hinted at something more, a subtext of threat, a pressure not to dig too deeply, as if invisible lines had been drawn around, not just the body, but the very facts themselves. Questions multiplied with every answer. Why D.C. and not New York? Was it chance, or did Anastasia have unfinished business in the capital, ties to congressmen, diplomats, or contractors who might have wanted her silenced? Some investigators whispered about covert meetings and encrypted texts left on her recovered phone. Others fixated on financial records that seemed to intersect ominously with defense contracts and foreign aid packages. There was faint, tantalizing evidence that Anastasia had kept a digital cache, an encrypted notebook perhaps, or a flash drive containing sensitive deals. The drive, of course, was missing. Meanwhile, the impact on everyone around her was immediate and visceral. Her cousin, who had been the one to first report Anastasia missing in New York, became nearly catatonic with grief and rage, alternating between giving interviews and refusing to see anyone. Friends, some genuinely heartbroken, others perhaps more interested in their own reputations, spoke in stunned, rehearsed tones to journalists. The Russian embassy, already pressuring NYPD, demanded an international inquiry and sent top staff to monitor the investigation. In whispered asides, the phrase, politically motivated, began its steady climb into public conversation. There were ugly accusations and wild speculation too. Had this been a message to silence whistleblowers, a warning to those who might expose the tangled connections between commerce and espionage? Or was it payback for a failed business deal, a dark inflection point where personal vendetta met global intrigue? Watching the case unfold from a reporter's vantage, I sensed that every new fact had to be vetted. Every leak, every tip, every off-the-record briefing seemed tinged with ulterior motive. The press, for their part, devoured every shred of the story, branding Anastasia's image across primetime screens and tabloid covers, spinning her life and death into both tragedy and scandal. But the one thing that remained, all evidence aside, was that the nation's capital had just become the epicenter of a crime with ramifications far beyond the woods and city blocks. The grim tableau of Anastasia's final resting place became both a symbol and a warning. In a world built on power, connections, and secrets, sometimes the only reminder of the truth that's been buried is the shock of what's uncovered. To those who knew her, to the family who loved her, and to all who witnessed the investigation unfold, the forest near Washington became a haunted borderland between official narrative and suppressed reality, proof that, even when lives are snuffed out, the reverberations can never be so easily concealed. Diplomatic pressure and global communication. The discovery of Anastasia Gregory's body near Washington, D.C. did more than just fuel a sensational crime investigation. It became a flashpoint for international tension and a test of how thoroughly media and diplomacy could complicate and sometimes derail the pursuit of truth. I remember vividly how, in the days following the revelation, television screens across America and Russia were saturated with Anastasia's image, her poised, enigmatic smile juxtaposed against headlines screaming of conspiracy, scandal, and secrets lying at the highest echelons of two global superpowers. Diplomatic channels pulsed with an urgency I'd rarely seen. Official statements from Russia condemned the attack and fiercely demanded transparency. Their embassy in Washington called the crime an attack on one of our daughters, and their words carried a veiled threat. If justice wasn't swift, if the U.S. didn't provide full access and cooperation, relations could sour further, never mind the already strained state of US-Russia relations amid competing interests on nearly every global front. In this moment, Anastasia's case upended the normal calculus of diplomacy. High-level meetings between American and Russian officials had the undercurrent of mutual mistrust and political maneuvering that was usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations, not murder cases. The American response was measured on the surface, yet clearly fraught. Officials walked a tightrope between projecting confidence in the investigation and avoiding any appearance of being controlled or pressured by foreign powers. Behind closed doors, there were signs of real exasperation. I heard senior law enforcement officers grumble about the constant phone calls from both embassies and the State Department, the scrutiny of every public statement, and the choreography required to keep both public outrage and international relations in check. All the while, the global media kicked into a frenzy. Within 48 hours, Anastasia's story dominated coverage on all continents. CNN and Fox News hammered on the theme of possible corruption or government collusion, while Russian outlets lingered over her heritage, casting her as both a cosmopolitan victim and a symbol of vulnerability abroad. British tabloids ran with condescending headlines about transatlantic intrigue, filling column inches with speculation about shadowy intelligence services, mafia debts, and double lives. Meanwhile, French, German, and Middle Eastern media took a more analytical approach, delving into what Anastasia's death might mean for ongoing diplomatic currents between East and West. The pressure cooker atmosphere wasn't just reserved for diplomats and reporters. Protesters gathered outside both the Russian and American embassies in New York and D.C. Some cried out for justice for Anastasia, others waved signs punctuated with more cynical slogans about government cover-ups and the price of speaking the wrong secrets. In Moscow, candlelight vigils quickly transformed into political theater, with officials giving televised speeches that blurred the line between memorial and indictment of U.S. failings. American officials responded in kind, trying to reassure the public that every resource was being devoted to the case, even as some privately doubted their ability to stay ahead of both the diplomatic narrative and the media storm. It was impossible to separate the murder investigation from its larger geopolitical context. Russia sent special prosecutors and intelligence analysts, insisting on joint evidence reviews and even offering use of their own forensic labs, an offer the FBI stiffly declined but could not ignore entirely. Every attempt by either side to assert control over the investigation became a new skirmish, reported on breathlessly by global media and watched, sometimes manipulated by political operatives with their own stakes in the outcome. Inside the investigation, the atmosphere darkened further. Every new development, a lead on a suspect, a retrieved phone, a missing piece of security footage, had to be filtered not only through law enforcement protocols, but also the diplomatic sensitivities of two nations that rarely trusted one another. Agents found themselves second-guessing every move, aware that a single slip could spark a new round of accusations or, at worst, a full-blown international incident. Off the record, some investigators confided to me that they suspected certain leaks and anonymous sources feeding journalists were not mere accidents, but deliberate tactics by one embassy or the other to sway public opinion or pressure negotiators. Social media only amplified this climate of suspicion and spectacle. Trending hashtags blurred the facts into a torrent of theories. #Justice for Anastasia, #SpyGames, #DC cover-up. Instagram accounts poured over her last known movements while amateur sleuths on Reddit mapped out conspiracy webs tying her fate to politicians, arms deals, and espionage networks. The narrative became fragmented, each faction, be it a media outlet, diplomatic mission, or grassroots movement, interpreting the facts to suit their worldview or strategic objectives. For the family, it was a never-ending assault. Their grief transformed into a kind of symbolic battlefield, their daughter's life and death endlessly dissected on talk shows and in political debates. What struck me most was the sense of helplessness shared by almost everyone outside the small core investigative team. The Russian government threatened sanctions and demanded international oversight. The U.S. intelligence community sent high-level briefings up the White House chain, wary that the exposure of any intelligence link, real or imagined, could spark chaos. Meanwhile, NGOs and human rights groups begged for transparency, pointing out the tragic pattern of mysterious deaths and disappearances connected to individuals with ties to global power structures. The tension played out not just in headlines but in markets, diplomatic receptions, and even at the United Nations, where delegates subtly invoked Anastasia's name in debates about state secrecy, human trafficking, and the murky intersection of wealth, politics, and violence. For ordinary Americans and Russians, the case became a kind of social Rorschach, a way to vent frustration about larger governmental failures. In the U.S., Anastasia's death was held up by some as a symbol of the dangers faced by whistleblowers and the powerful's disregard for the rule of law. Others saw it as evidence of foreign meddling and institutional corruption. In Russia, official channels lionized her as a prodigal daughter caught between hostile systems, a pawn in a grand geopolitical struggle. Each side used her memory for its own narratives, which sometimes even drowned out the very real tragedy at the heart of the case. The cumulative weight of all this pressure left its mark on the investigation. Promising leads mysteriously dried up or were stonewalled by diplomatic immunity. Evidence disappeared, sometimes explained away as bureaucratic error, though few believed such explanations. Law enforcement, rather than feeling empowered, walked on eggshells, fearful of igniting another conflict or handing an opponent a propaganda victory. Privately, several detectives and agents wondered aloud if they would ever be able to get beyond the politics to bring those truly responsible to justice. For the world, Anastasia's murder became a tragic case study in just how fragile the search for truth can be when caught in the crossfire of global politics and relentless, unyielding publicity. Clues about those involved with power. The deeper the investigators, and I, ventured into the tangled web connected to Anastasia Gregory, the clearer it became that her disappearance and murder were not born of chance or a simple personal vendetta. Instead, we found ourselves staring into the shifting mosaic of extraordinary power with connections that reached into the highest levels of American government, intelligence, business, and even global institutions. This wasn't rumor-mongering. Every new detail uncovered revealed hints of something meticulously orchestrated and uniquely dangerous. One of the central figures to emerge was Richard Langdon, the national security advisor and trusted confidant of the president. With a reputation for discretion, intelligence, and ruthlessness, Langdon was known in elite corridors as a man who made problems disappear. However, the press drew immediate attention to his intimate connection with Anastasia, casting him in a suspicious light. Langdon's relationship with Anastasia was far from clandestine in insider circles, though the specifics were shrouded in coded language, business partnerships, and whispers at private dinners. Some spoke of a mutual fascination, others of a transactional relationship driven by favors, money, and the promise of political leverage. When questioned, Langdon denied any involvement in her death, but evidence mounted: frequent encrypted communications, unexplained financial transfers, and hotel rendezvous confirmed by security logs. Yet Langdon was hardly the only high-profile figure with ties to Anastasia. As the investigation peeled away the facade, names surfaced: cabinet members, industry leaders, diplomats from both the U.S. and abroad. Phone records suggested she'd been in touch not only with Langdon but also with several key staffers in the Department of Defense and State. Investigators discovered that her passport showed recent entries and exits to countries considered hotspots in global intelligence, including Turkey, the UAE, and the Baltic states. Every trip raised bigger questions. Was she a simple facilitator, a pawn in a much greater game, or an active agent weaving her own net of influence? It was impossible to ignore the political gravity pulling at the case. The corridors of the White House grew tense, statements to the press became sanitized, reviewers from multiple agencies pored over every scrap of evidence before it was cleared even for internal memos. Rumors flew that a special crisis committee had been formed, with Langdon and several close allies at its heart. Occasionally, cryptic calls would alert lead investigators to mistaken evidence or urge them behind closed doors to shift priority away from powerful suspects. Some detectives began fearing their phones were tapped, not paranoid delusion, but a reasonable conclusion given the eerie synchronicity between private police briefings and the narrative emerging in national media. At the same time, a new twist arrived, with the focus on two members of the vice president's private security detail, both experienced SWAT operators seconded to the White House. Their names appeared on access logs at multiple sites frequented by Anastasia, always logged in just before or after her. Neither of them would cooperate fully with the investigation, citing national security and special assignments. It was clear that some invisible hand was guiding their actions, or at the very least shielding them from scrutiny. Others within the Beltway whispered that Anastasia, with her unassuming charm and unique background, had been a go-between for these men and certain international interests. Soon, the team tracked another powerful player, this time from the private sector, a reclusive tech billionaire who remained unnamed in public reports, but was known for his aggressive lobbying, substantial defense contracts, and occasional appearances at parties Anastasia either hosted or attended. Leaked email chains suggested she brokered introductions between this billionaire and at least 2 members of Congress, opening doors to military-industrial deals worth hundreds of millions. What began as a list of simple acquaintances quickly snowballed into a timeline mapping direct contact between the victim and power brokers, whose interests stretched from Capitol Hill to offshore accounts in Zurich and Singapore. Handling this information was a nightmare for the department. Political backchannels buzzed with activity. Pressure mounted from both the Justice Department and NSC advisors to keep the most sensitive threads off the record. Behind the scenes, several career prosecutors debated seeking grand jury indictments, but found themselves stonewalled, either by executive privilege, missing documentation, or sudden national security designations slapped onto key evidence. Time after time, evidence collected pointed toward the same rarefied circles, but every approach led investigators to internal obstacles, lost witnesses, or in one infamous incident, a critical whistleblower suddenly disappearing into the federal witness protection system. Meanwhile, Anastasia's cousin, now desperate for answers and justice, met with private attorneys and journalists with a reputation for exposing government wrongdoing. Together they leaked select portions of the case to reputable news outlets, resulting in a brutal tug-of-war between the press, government, and law enforcement. International media seized on the firestorm, particularly as hints of foreign intelligence agencies began circling the story. Some analysts speculated openly that multiple governments might have assets present in D.C. willing to silence or manipulate witnesses. The web of power and privilege wasn't just constricting, it actively distorted the investigation's course. In heated internal meetings, some detectives argued to push forward with interviews and subpoenas, no matter how high the target. Others, veterans of Washington's more sinister power games, begged for caution, citing the mysterious accidents and career suicides that had befallen previous would-be whistleblowers. It became obvious that for every puzzle piece connecting Anastasia to another power broker, several more pieces were being swept quietly under the rug. As speculation about government involvement grew, the legal and political stakes escalated. Allegations swirled of unrecorded executive flights to Maryland, untraceable cash payments, and even encrypted communications between key suspects and shadowy entities overseas. Despite intense public pressure and the squad's mounting frustration, nobody at the very top, not Langdon, not the vice president's staff, not the defense contractors, was ever officially brought in for a full public interview under oath. The system protected itself even as it nominally pursued the truth. To the world, Anastasia's death began to look less like a crime of passion or business rivalry, and more like a tragic, cautionary tale about what happens when someone stands at the intersection of secrets, ambition, and unchecked power. For the investigators, the experience was both sobering and terrifying, a journey through privilege as armor, truth as a liability, and the limits of justice when it collides with the invisible but unbreakable bonds at the very top. Other suspects. The sealed operation of special forces. The existence of other suspects, particularly within the ranks of elite special forces and clandestine law enforcement units, introduced an entirely new and unsettling dimension to Anastasia Gregory's case. From almost the very beginning, whispers circulated that some elements of the investigation were being influenced or even manipulated outright by individuals operating in the shadows of America's most secretive institutions. The deeper the official inquiry dug, the clearer it became that there were at least a handful of professionals, men and women who specialized in operating beyond the reach of conventional oversight, whose movements, conduct, and possible motivations required the highest level of scrutiny. One rumor in particular grew difficult to ignore, reaching both the halls of power and quiet corners of the investigative unit, that the operation which ultimately led to Anastasia's murder might have been orchestrated using personnel from an elite cross-agency task force. This team, shrouded in secrecy and answerable only to the highest echelons of government, was speculated to have access to technology, intelligence, resources, and legal immunity far beyond what typical law enforcement or military branches could muster. Former intelligence officials, speaking strictly off the record, hinted at call signs, flight logs, and procurement orders that seemed to vanish from all standard databases as soon as they became relevant to the timeline of Anastasia's disappearance and death. Much of the evidence for these suspicions was circumstantial but remarkably consistent. Several anonymous tips led investigators to review the visitor and personnel logs for sensitive government facilities in the greater Washington, D.C. area. Astoundingly, they uncovered overlapping access records, specialized vehicles checked in and out of secure lots at odd hours, mission briefings scrubbed from electronic logs, and biometric entries that lined up almost perfectly with key developments in the timeline of Anastasia's ordeal. When the chain of command was pursued, requests for clarification were met with classified designations, missing paperwork, and, on at least 2 occasions, direct orders from higher authority to stand down for national security interests. Even more perplexing was the composition of this shadowy group. Unlike conventional SWAT or military units, this team included members with dual backgrounds, law enforcement officers granted special clearances, ex-military contractors with decades of black ops experience, and civilian analysts with links to intelligence gathering. Their cohesion and operational security were legendary among those who had heard of them, making them exceedingly difficult to investigate or question. Calls for interviews were stymied by claims of ongoing operations, diplomatic sensitivity, or the invocation of federal secrecy statutes. During internal police meetings, debates flared over whether probing into this task force's activities might jeopardize national security or even the investigators' own safety. Some officers, racked with unease, recalled subtle warnings and unexpected visits from men in suits, interactions that bore the chilly professionalism of those used to managing existential threats for a living. As these special agents kept surfacing at critical junctures in the case file, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Their presence always coincided with moments when evidence disappeared, witnesses backtracked, or official versions of events were hastily rewritten. Speculation ran rampant that the core rationale behind their involvement was not simply to cover up a botched operation, but to secure several layers of national interest. Anastasia, it turned out, had crossed paths with sensitive projects, encrypted communications traced to satellite uplinks, business dealings that tiptoed the line between commerce and classified initiatives, and personal contacts with known associates of high-clearance government officials. The question gnawed at the investigative core: had her murder been an accidental byproduct of a larger mission gone awry, or was she intentionally neutralized because she was seen as a threat to operations infinitely more important than the fate of any single individual? Public knowledge of these murky connections remained frustratingly scant, as the official storylines released to the press stressed rogue actors or potentially criminal elements without mention of institutional involvement. The FBI, when pressed by major media outlets, issued carefully worded denials. There is no evidence at this time of any active government agency or task force being involved in the Gregory case. But the privately circulated internal memos, some of which would later be leaked, told a very different story. There was an unspoken understanding among career investigators that pursuing these threads too forcefully could place their professional and personal lives at risk. Meanwhile, forensic evidence only further muddied the waters. Unidentified DNA was discovered at the Maryland crime scene, a partial match to known government employees but never conclusively tied to any one suspect. Other evidence pointed to the use of surveillance countermeasures, including false digital footprints and GPS distortions, all methods straight from the toolkit of federal surveillance units. Attempts to subpoena travel records and communication logs for key persons of interest were repeatedly blocked by legal action citing state secrets or national security exemptions. This climate of uncertainty and fear grew so intense within the investigative ranks that, quietly, a subgroup of detectives began working off the official clock, holding meetings in undisclosed locations, encrypting their notes, and using old-fashioned dead drops to avoid interception. Their aim was not just to uncover who on the ground might have carried out the operation that ended Anastasia's life, but who had the motive, authority, and capability to set such a chain of events in motion. Interviews with former members of similar task forces suggested that orders for such an act would rarely originate from a single individual. Instead, they would be delivered through a web of compartmentalized need-to-know briefings, enacted by operatives who sometimes did not even know the full context of their mission. At the same time, the circle of suspicion expanded beyond those physically present near the crime scene. It reached up through command hierarchies, touched political aides with backgrounds in national defense contracting, and even included a few foreign operatives whose names turned up on phone records and intercepted emails. This overlap hinted at the possibility of a multinational effort, or at minimum, the cover of plausible deniability engineered by intelligence agencies deeply invested in keeping their assets and methods secret. Media speculation on the Special Task Force theory soon took on a life of its own, with investigative journalists following digital breadcrumbs and obscure budget appropriations to covert divisions operating under abbreviations unknown to the general public. Leaked testimonies described unmarked helicopters landing near federal sites, asset transfers routed through dummy corporations, and vague training missions carried out precisely in the time frame of Anastasia's disappearance. Anonymous sources, including 2 former federal agents, went on record suggesting that what happened to Anastasia was symptomatic of a broader pattern: the merging of elite law enforcement and intelligence capabilities into shadowy forces capable of operating with practical immunity. These ghost units could be loaned out for interagency missions, political cleanups, or highly sensitive international operations, always insulated by thick layers of misdirection, classified budgets, and legal ambiguity. In their telling, Anastasia's death might have represented a rare leak in this otherwise watertight system, a moment of overreach that left enough exposed threads to keep the case alive in the public imagination but not enough to unravel the whole operation. Inside the law enforcement community, the fallout from this line of inquiry was palpable. Trust broke down between agencies. Finger-pointing and subtle accusations colored every joint briefing. Some officials argued that the real threat lay not in chasing down ghosts, but in failing to maintain the trust of the public. Others, more cynical or perhaps more seasoned, insisted that reform was impossible, so long as key evidence remained locked away from any outside oversight. Quietly, some officers transferred to new assignments citing burnout or family reasons, though rumors persisted that some were encouraged to leave as a means of keeping sensitive details under wraps. Despite a mountain of circumstantial evidence, legal avenues to prosecute any suspects affiliated with these elite units inevitably hit a wall. Charges brought before federal courts were dismissed for lack of admissible evidence, witnesses refused to testify, and appellate judges routinely cited irreparable damage to national interests as a justification for dismissing the most damning precedents. The Gregory case thus entered a sort of legal twilight, a realm in which everyone acknowledged wrongdoing but nobody could be held to account, while so many doors remained locked behind the shield of national security. For those of us following the case, the realization was sobering. The Special Task Force, if it existed in the form alleged, represented both the most advanced and the most unaccountable edge of American institutional power. Such groups were designed to protect the state from existential threats, but in practice could, once set in motion with the wrong intent, obliterate the lives of those unlucky enough to cross invisible lines. In Anastasia's story, the murky footprint of these units became less a question of individual guilt and more a glaring indictment of a system that tolerated shadow operations with so little recourse for oversight or justice. In the aftermath, all that remained was a lingering sense of injustice, and the knowledge that any future transgressions by these forces would likely be buried even deeper. The memory of Anastasia Gregory, and the unquenchable questions about her death, became an unofficial warning, one whispered among journalists, activists, and investigators alike, that beneath the glittering surface of power, the shadow world of covert operations often holds the truest secrets, and the victims are nearly always left without recourse or closure. Unexpected turns in legal proceedings and trial. The legal odyssey that unfolded after Anastasia Gregory's murder defied every expectation of predictability and fairness, an unrelenting carousel of shocking reversals, procedural chaos, power plays, and public outrage. From the outset, experienced attorneys and veteran court reporters privately confessed they'd never witnessed a prosecution so fraught with invisible obstacles, vanishing witnesses, inconsistent testimony, and the ever-present shadow of state privilege. It was as if every turning point in the case was choreographed by some unseen hand determined to keep the truth just out of reach. The first twist emerged during the initial pre-trial hearings. Defense attorneys for the 2 SWAT officers, both visibly hardened, tight-lipped men, filed a barrage of challenges, accusations of evidence tampering, claims of entrapment, and warnings that their clients were being scapegoated for political convenience. Under cross-examination, forensic experts conceded that several DNA samples and digital records had inexplicably gone missing while under federal custody. An independent tech consultant working for the defense revealed a trail of vandalized metadata, with security footage missing entire sequences during critical windows. The implication was obvious: either gross incompetence or a calculated effort by someone with high-level access to sabotage the integrity of the investigation. Even more bewildering was the treatment of witnesses. Court orders to appear were repeatedly disregarded by high-ranking government personnel, whose absence was justified with vague references to national security or medical emergencies. Several scheduled witnesses vanished into obscurity, reportedly transferred overseas or placed on extended administrative leave. Two former security contractors, central to the prosecution's argument, filed late-night affidavits recanting key portions of their earlier statements, each claiming to have been coerced or selectively quoted. The judge, harried, visibly frustrated but limited by the constraints of the bench, could only warn the respective agencies of contempt, a gesture that quickly became symbolic rather than effective. At the heart of the proceedings lay Richard Langdon, the national security advisor whose every utterance sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the press. On the advice of White House legal counsel, Langdon invoked executive privilege each time he was summoned, refusing to answer virtually every substantive question. Despite mounting public suspicion and the existence of encrypted communications between Langdon and Anastasia Gregory days before her disappearance, no direct indictment materialized. Instead, the court was treated to a parade of polished government lawyers arguing the case in circles, insisting on the sanctity of classified operations and threatening to trigger legal crises if compelled to share any more information. Media coverage of the trial spiked with every development. News vans lined up outside the courthouse, and journalists hungrily dissected leaked transcripts, recorded outbursts, and the parade of government attorneys in dark suits. Coverage oscillated between hope, when it seemed as though the SWAT officers would face penalty, and cynicism, as yet another evidentiary roadblock appeared just before key revelations could be made public. Public confidence in the trial's transparency faltered, with commentators suggesting that the entire process was a masterclass in plausible deniability and distraction tactics. In a stunning and telling moment, a whistleblower inside the Department of Justice attempted to deliver a sealed packet of physical evidence to the court, a backup of phone records, a USB drive, and handwritten notes purportedly detailing communications between Langdon and a third party. Before the materials could be authenticated, a federal agent intervened, citing chain-of-custody violations and national security risks, and the evidence was excluded. Weeks wore on, and the judicial process devolved into a high-stakes contest of attrition. Defense teams for both accused officers argued that they had been set up to take the fall for higher-ups, presenting circumstantial evidence that they had followed direct orders from a classified chain of command. The prosecution, stymied by the loss of physical and testimonial evidence, leaned heavily on character attacks and emotional appeals to the jury. Deliberations were delayed repeatedly by closed-door hearings and private motions regarding the scope of classified information allowed in open court. Outside the courtroom, pressure mounted from all directions. The Russian government's legal delegation demanded international oversight. U.S. political factions called press conferences decrying the process as rigged, while advocacy groups filed petitions urging a federal inquiry. The public grew increasingly polarized. Some saw the indicted SWAT officers as tragic pawns, others as willing agents of conspiracy, and still others as scapegoats for an untouchable cabal of the nation's most powerful leaders. The trial's most dramatic twists unfolded as the jury finally convened. After days of uncertain deliberation, a mistrial was declared. Too many jurors found the gaps in evidence and the fog of secrecy around core facts insurmountable. In response, federal prosecutors vowed to retry, provoking a fresh cascade of motions, delays, and political threats. Months later, a new judge, an appointee known for advocating transparency but no stranger to establishment interests, presided over the retrial. The same pattern emerged: witness tampering allegations, missing surveillance tapes, and ever-present warnings that the lives of those involved might be at risk. In a moment that would later be replayed endlessly on cable news, one juror broke down sobbing as she described being followed home and receiving anonymous calls warning her of the consequences if she voted the wrong way. The defense seized every available opening, launching fiery attacks on the credibility of government witnesses. One line of questioning finally succeeded in revealing that a key FBI analyst had previously participated in counterintelligence operations somehow linked to both Anastasia and members of her social circle. Despite this, the presiding judge ruled that any further questioning or subpoenaing of national security documents was off limits, unless and until the president personally authorized their release, a development that would never materialize. By the trial's final act, the case had become less about justice for Anastasia Gregory and more about institutional self-preservation. With no direct evidence against the highest authorities and a mounting fear of national security fallout, the prosecution's case unraveled. In a legal sleight of hand, the indictment against the SWAT officers was split. One was acquitted due to irreparable doubt, while the other was convicted on lesser charges of obstruction and misconduct, not murder. The sentence, time served and a dishonorable discharge, was widely seen as a compromise pitched to avoid riots or an outright collapse of public trust. As for Langdon and the other senior officials whose names had circulated in rumor but not indictment, the verdict was utter silence. The administration issued a statement pledging to respect both the legal process and classified boundaries. Congressional attempts to hold independent hearings met with closed doors, subpoena refusals, and a level of bureaucratic stonewalling that was both impressive and now eerily familiar. In the end, the prosecution of Anastasia's murder delivered neither closure nor accountability. The legal spectacle further deepened cynicism. For some, it was proof that in the pantheon of American power, justice was a concept to be weaponized and redirected. For the investigators and attorneys who had hoped to make a difference, it was a haunting reminder that the machinery of state, when tested by scandal, nearly always finds a way to protect itself first, even at the expense of truth. The conspiracy behind classified documents and corruption at the highest levels. Long before Anastasia Gregory's disappearance, there were rumor-laced whispers running beneath the diplomatic and business dealings that snaked through Washington, New York, and major European capitals. As the investigation peeled away layers of her life, a disturbing truth began to crystallize, one that pointed toward a complex, meticulously orchestrated conspiracy engineered to safeguard not only individual reputations, but the very foundations of global deals affecting entire governments. It began with a single overlooked memo unearthed by a dogged French investigative reporter, once embedded with major European wire services. Her knowledge of American bureaucracy and European intelligence protocols gave her a rare vantage point. Through careful cultivation of both sources and leaked documents, she uncovered encrypted communications, buried among diplomatic cables and defense industry telegrams, that alluded to an illicit transfer of military technology. The smoking gun, as she labeled it, wasn't just the deal itself, but the network of facilitation, bribery, and blackmail surrounding it. Anastasia had been an intermediary. Fluent in 3 languages, trusted on both sides as neither an outright government operative nor a complete outsider, she was the linchpin brokers relied on to soothe egos, polish terms, and furnish plausible deniability for the higher-ups. What set her apart, however, was an apparent refusal to tolerate the extent of the graft. Initial wire transfers and scheduling confirmations painted a picture of a colossal weapons deal between American contractors and several allied, but competing, European states. Heavy commissions for consultants were coded as research fees, then laundered through offshore accounts managed by shell foundations. Anastasia's emails reveal a shift. Early on, she played along with the system. Over time, her tone grew wary, her demands for documentation more explicit. Her access to classified materials was no accident. She had been brought in not only to translate contracts but to resolve discrepancies, sign off official statements, and run interference when suspicions arose. When she became privy to the full extent of the backroom agreements, including the estimated $200 million routinely siphoned into secret caches for top-tier politicians, she acted. Colleagues recall late-night meetings, panicked phone calls, and the arrival of unidentified men offering insurance policies, if she kept silent, or threats if she didn't. The most damning evidence surfaced when the French journalist managed to decrypt a batch of documents labeled under a notorious NATO codename. Among the files, lists of American and European defense ministers, senior national security advisors, lobbyists and bankers, each assigned unique transfer codes and payment schedules. In chilling detail, these logs showed the allocation of slush funds used to buy influence in government procurement processes. Anastasia's name appeared repeatedly, curiously sometimes in the role of go-between, sometimes in warning notes scribbled by risk managers expressing concern about her growing reluctance and the possibility that she might turn. The core of the conspiracy was a series of shadow contracts, off-the-books agreements that allowed for the movement of small arms, classified targeting software, and military-grade components into countries otherwise prohibited from receiving them by international law. American oversight committees were either paid off, distracted with bogus compliance reports, or in some cases actively involved in crafting legal loopholes. One senator in particular, a champion of transparency on camera but in private, a relentless advocate for defense corporate interests, appeared in private dispatches vouching for Anastasia's diplomatic skills, signaling she was already on more powerful radars than she ever realized. What ultimately sealed her fate, investigators now believe, was a brief but explosive sequence of leaks sent directly from Anastasia to both American and European newsrooms. These messages, encoded and incomplete, referenced a final payout not delivered, a hush money arrangement intended to secure her silence after the closing of a particularly lucrative contract. The details remain hazy, but several recovered texts indicate she began to demand assurance that this sum would be paid, not as an act of greed, but as leverage to guarantee her safety. Instead of compliance, the response was cold, surveillance, intimidation, and eventually the retraction by several contacts who now saw her as a liability. Attempts to track these secret transactions ran into the brick wall of diplomatic immunity and executive privilege. Private banking records intercepted by cyber units working off the books provided hints of vast sums routed through Swiss, Luxembourg, and Caribbean banks. A tangled web of numbered accounts, many set up in the names of family members of senior officials, linked the bribes directly to legislation passed in pivotal defense appropriations committees. At the epicenter of the entire cartel was a black ledger, referenced in several encrypted phone calls. This document was rumored to contain every step of the illicit scheme, names, dates, account numbers, and results of every major exchange. Its existence was fiercely denied in official circles, but one low-level aide confessed to seeing a redacted version, pages missing, others heavily marked in black ink. According to him, Anastasia was the only non-government person ever referenced by name in the context of final payouts. As the conspiracy unraveled publicly, damage control mechanisms kicked in everywhere. Whistleblowers were silenced by reassignment, discrediting, or in some cases, outright threats to their lives and families. Defense contractors held closed-door meetings with government liaisons, drafting statements that blamed overzealous middlemen or so-called rogue foreign agents. The few mid-level bureaucrats arrested during the initial round of the scandal saw their charges dismissed in closed proceedings. Congress held fiery hearings, but, in the absence of classified material, most of it missing, destroyed, or reclassified beyond reach, no major players faced public consequences. Internationally, the effects were corrosive. European governments launched their own inquiries, but most fizzled under diplomatic pressure. French lawmakers called for full transparency, but were stonewalled by executive privilege. The Parliamentary Assembly demanded the release of all documents relating to the arms deal, only to receive heavily censored files. In Germany, rumors flew that a political donor with ties to the deal had quietly resigned. In the UK, a single MP gave a fiery speech before abruptly withdrawing her support for an investigation. For the investigative reporter who pieced together the greatest single trove of evidence, life became a harrowing cycle of safe house relocations and encrypted communication. She published select findings, enough to stoke public outrage but not enough to prompt a full institutional collapse or further endanger lives. Anastasia's family, meanwhile, faced a stone wall. Every request for public disclosure was met with technical denials or vague assurances the truth would emerge in due course. Their independent efforts to retain former intelligence officers as advisors and legal counsel led only to more dead ends. Files were sealed, witnesses disappeared, and the process ground further to a halt. For the world, the conspiracy behind Anastasia Gregory's death painted a dark picture, that at the highest levels of power, lines between national security, private enrichment, and criminal activity can blur beyond recognition. When trust is traded for immunity and secrets for profit, individuals become expendable, collateral in the ceaseless race to secure advantages for a privileged few. Her story endures not just as a tragedy but as a warning, one fitfully illuminated by the rare, brave soul unwilling to look away when the system's rot is exposed. An ambiguous outcome and lingering echoes. The conclusion of the Anastasia Gregory case did not provide clarity or catharsis. Instead, it left a residue of ambiguity, suspicions, and collective unease that still lingers in the minds of all who followed it. No headline declared justice served, No courtroom gave a sense of finality, and the story, even as public interest waned, only grew more tangled and mythic in retelling. To outsiders, it might have appeared that, over time, the ripples from Anastasia's disappearance and violent end would dissipate, that a new sensation or crisis would eventually overtake the news cycle. That never truly happened. The unresolved nature of her case continued to act as a kind of open wound in both the official record and the cultural psyche. Each fresh documentary, podcast, or anniversary feature reanimated old questions. Who really orchestrated her death? Was it a crime of state, of commerce, or of passion? Did anyone in power, in law enforcement or beyond, ever want the real answers to emerge? Within the corridors of power, the curious mixture of official silence and rumors gave birth to a cottage industry of conspiracy theories. In Washington and New York, lifelong bureaucrats, ambitious interns, and embattled journalists traded stories in hushed tones about dossiers that were suddenly resealed, or internal memos mentioning Anastasia's name that vanished from the archive system. Lawyers, too, whispered of cases stalling inexplicably, of evidence requests denied under executive privilege, or, more alarmingly, of witnesses who had either recanted or simply disappeared, most often after quiet conversations with men in understated suits. For Anastasia's family there was no closure. Her cousin, once fiery in pursuit of justice, grew increasingly reclusive and was often unwilling to speak to anyone beyond a circle of trusted confidants. Some friends became strangers, whether out of fear or exhaustion, while others obsessed over new leads or rabbit holes, never truly moving on. The family's home became a magnet for letters, some expressing support, others accusing them of opportunism or conspiracy, all evidence of a society unable to process the ambiguity left in the case's wake. Among the broader public, the case's unresolved nature triggered a spectrum of responses. Some saw Anastasia as a tragic victim of ruthless power, a cautionary tale confirming their worst fears about those who pull the world's levers. Others, more cynical or world-weary, simply shrugged and pointed to the long history of high-profile unsolved crimes, treating her case as just one more symptom of a system designed to protect itself. But for a vocal and passionate minority, the case became a rallying point, a reason to pressure elected officials for more governmental transparency, stronger protections for whistleblowers, and a renewed focus on curbing institutional corruption. The media, never one to let a good story rest, continued to stoke embers of both hope and suspicion. Investigative journalists, working well beyond the paywall, published lengthy exposés and feature-length pieces attempting to retrace every step, every shadow, every awkward silence in the official record. Some reporters, working in partnership with international outlets, claimed to have found new evidence, encrypted emails, off-the-record interviews, or digital ledgers hinting at the final weeks of Anastasia's life. Yet, time and again, every apparent revelation either fizzled under scrutiny, was quickly shut down by legal threats, or simply led to more questions. The ambiguous ending also affected American society's relationship with power and truth. Ordinary people, over morning coffee or in the echo chambers of social media, debated the meaning of justice, the reach of secret alliances, and the fragility of any individual caught between corrupt institutions and global intrigue. Hashtags like #JusticeForAnastasia or #BringTruthToLight resurfaced with each new development, serving not only as digital memorials but as desperate appeals for some sense of accountability in an age of secrecy. In the more rarefied circles of policy and law enforcement, the case took on the air of an unspoken lesson, a demonstration that the rule of law, for all its ideals, can falter when it clashes with entrenched interests. Young investigators regarded Anastasia's file almost as a forbidden text, cited in internal training as a warning about the limits of persistence and the subtle terror of pushing too far against the invisible machinery of the state. For those who lived through the events personally or professionally, the ambiguity was never just academic. A handful of officers retired soon after the case closed, citing burnout or family commitments, but neighbors and colleagues gossiped about veiled threats and unmarked cars idling late at night. At least one prosecutor quietly moved abroad, and a key journalist who had covered the story disappeared from public view, her last major byline an oblique op-ed about the cost of seeking truth in a post-truth era. Internationally, Anastasia's case became a symbol for activists and diplomats alike, a shorthand reference at human rights conferences and in discussions about cross-border judicial cooperation. In Russia, some commentators painted her as a martyr, while in Europe her story joined a global critique of transnational corruption and the shadow economy. But even here narratives diverged. Was she a victim, a complicit insider, or merely collateral damage in a chess match between rivals no one dared name? Over time, physical reminders of Anastasia lingered. The luxury hotel in Manhattan where she was last seen continued to attract whispers of scandal, and the wooded Maryland site of her grim discovery became a kind of haunted spot for both reporters and true crime pilgrims. Murals and graffiti, digital tributes and memorial websites sprang up in her honor, their tone ranging from reverential to angry. Her image, sometimes stylized, sometimes heartbreakingly unguarded, became a touchstone for artists and activists seeking to confront the interplay between power, loss, and remembrance. Yet, perhaps the greatest legacy left by the ambiguity was a cultural wound that refused to close, a sense that the answers, if they ever existed, were as far from reach as the day she vanished. Justice proved elusive, and the call for truth only grew more urgent as other scandals and crises rose and fell around the void her story left behind. As I reflect on the unresolved saga of Anastasia Gregory, I cannot help but feel that her story, with all its missing pages and lingering shadows, is less an isolated tragedy than a mirror of uncomfortable truths about the modern world. In a time when information is both weapon and currency, and where power frequently operates in darkness, her case stands as a continual reminder. Sometimes the most profound injustice is not a crime hidden, but a truth only half revealed. The case remains indefinitely an unfinished chapter, a sobering footnote to every conversation about justice, accountability, and the human cost of secrets kept at the highest levels. And so, the question persists in American memory and conscience. Will the truth about Anastasia Gregory ever see the light? Or will her unresolved fate be just another echo, ringing endlessly in the dark, demanding answers from a world that has become too skilled at looking away?